This is the Kohler Cimarron Class 6 toilet, introduced around 2009 and made up until either 2019 or 20, when it'll be discontinued and replaced with the Cimarron Revolution 360 toilet. Now, I'm not so sure where the Class 6 part comes from, but everyone uses it, including me. But when doing further research on this particular toilet, all I could find was the Kohler Cimarron or Kohler Cimarron Class 5. So, it's a very interesting mystery on where that part comes from, but I couldn't find anything about it. But in comparison to the original Kohler Cimarron Class 5, this toilet is definitely a lot different. So let's take a look at it and let's see how it compares. The overall design of this toilet is honestly not too bad. It is a bit simplistic, but it does have its own styling, which I do kind of like, even if it is very simplistic. The trapway opening is similar to most Kohler Class 5s out there, but you can tell that the siphon jet area is a little bit more quote-unquote built in. The tank parts are very simplistic for a Kohler like this. You got the handle, you got the fill valve, and of course you got the dreaded aqua piston, the flimsy piece of plastic which I love so much. Sarcasm, of course. This thing is so terrible. It doesn't stay open very long, it's very flimsy, it often breaks for most people, and it's just an awful system to deal with in general. I hate this a lot, and I wish Kohler would get rid of this and go back to flappers. But overall, the parts are pretty standard for a Kohler like this, for better or for worse. Let's have a look at some flushes now. Let's first do a press and release. It's a little bit different, but it's still very crappy. Now let's extend the flush. That's a little bit better, but still not that great, honestly. So, right from the get-go, you can definitely tell that the flush is a little bit different on this particular Cimarron compared to most other Kohler Class 5s. While it definitely is a little bit better, it still really isn't that great, honestly. It's still a straight-down flush. Now, I will also say that the flushes still can sometimes be a little bit inconsistent, as I have seen some fairly weak ones that flush terribly, so even the flushes are still a bit inconsistent. That's not great. So the pulling and siphon power is actually a little bit different, but how much so? On a press and release, it's still a bit crappy, but it's nowhere near as fast or as choppy as most other Kohler Class 5s. On extended flush, the pulling factor and siphoning is okay. It definitely lasts a lot longer compared to most Kohlers I've seen, and seems to do its job at pulling things down fairly well. You might have a little bit of regurgitation, but nowhere near as bad as something like most Kohler Class 5s, like a Kohler Highline, for example, which is very interesting. Here's where things get very interesting though, the performance. On a press and release flush, the performance really isn't the greatest, but it's definitely a lot better compared to most Kohler Class 5s out there. On extended flush though, the performance honestly is not that bad at all. In fact, this is probably one of the best performing Class 5s I've seen thus far. While I have seen some people say that most Kohler Class 5s perform fairly well, I really haven't seen that. This is literally the only toilet I have seen that on, and that's it. It's interesting though, considering that the original Kohler Cimarron from the 2000s performed like absolute crap, and now this performs fairly well. What a change that is, and honestly for the better. Now let's have a look at bow rinse. Honestly, it's still pretty crappy. On a press and release flush, the bow rinse is just way too short and barely applied, and of course on the extended flush, it's still pretty terrible. The main problem is that some of the rims just don't look to be working all that well, and it seems like it just misses some areas in general, not to mention the pointed down rim jets. So the bow rinse is still not good at all, unfortunately. And that's the Kohler Cimarron Class 5 or 6 toilet of the 2010s. Honestly, a very interesting change from its 2000s version. While it definitely has some upgrades to it, it's still a Class 5 at the end of the day and still really isn't the greatest. While it's definitely one of the best Class 5s out there, it still really isn't that good of a toilet as it does have its drawbacks. But let's put this toilet into the grading scale. Let's grade it. The overall design of the Kohler Cimarron actually looks quite interesting. Sure, it can be a bit basic looking, but it does have its own styling, so I'm giving it a 6. already know where I'm going with the tank parts. The parts are very simplistic, but the aqua piston sucks. I've already complained about the aqua piston enough, so I'm not going to waste your time here. The tank parts get a free as always. Yeah, the quality control is still crap. This mostly relies on the rim not being so greatly punctured out. Sometimes it seems like the ball rinse is just terrible, and of course the rim just don't seem to work all that well. Not to mention that the quality of the flush can also get downgraded too, as I have seen some weaker ones. So the quality control is still a free. The trap weight is mostly the same as most Kohler Class 5s out there, so it's also getting a 5. On a press and release flush, the flush really isn't that good. It's very crappy. It is a little bit different compared to most Kohler Class 5s though, so I'll give it credit where credit's due, but it's still getting a free. On an extended flush, it really isn't all that much exciting still. It gets a 4. The pulling and siphon power on a press and release is kind of crappy. It is a little bit better compared to most Kohler Class 5s, but still not that great. It's a 3. It's just way too short. On an extended flush though, the pulling and siphon power is okay. Compared to most Kohler Class 5s, the flush isn't super choppy and actually seems to be fairly effective, so it gets a 6. The performance on a press and release flush is pretty middle of the road. It's definitely better compared to most Class 5s though, so I'm giving it a 5, but still not that great. On an extended flush though, I gotta say that the performance is quite decent. Which honestly is shocking considering that most Class 5s don't really perform all that great, despite what most people claim. It's funny how we go from the 2000's version, which performs like absolute crap, to this version, which actually does fairly well. It's quite an upgrade, and I give it a 7. Unfortunately, this is still a Class 5, and of course the ball rinse still sucks. On a press and release flush, it's easily a 1, considering that it barely does anything, the ramjets are pointed straight down, and even some of the ramjets don't seem to work all that well. And on an extended flush, it's easily a 2. The ball rinse still sucks. Go figure. On the low end scale, the survivability really isn't the greatest. It's definitely better compared to most Class 5s, but still not that great. It gets a 4. On the higher end scale, the survivability is okay. It's a lot better compared to most Class 5s, and I give it a 6. Now let's take a look at the overall value of this toilet. On the lower end scale, it still really isn't that good. While it's a lot better compared to most Class 5s out there, it's still very crappy. The flush is still crappy, the ball rinse is still awful, and sure, some things might be slightly upgraded, but still not worth getting at its lower end scale, and it gets a free. On the high end scale, when you extend the flush, it is a little bit better, but it's still a Class 5. The flush still really isn't that good and very inconsistent, and of course the ball rinse still sucks. But the pulling and siphon power is a lot better, and the performance is actually fairly decent. So you could say this is one of the better Class 5s out there, which really isn't saying much considering that most of them suck still anyways. While yes, this is still one of the better Class 5s out there, it's still nothing spectacular at the end of the day. And of course still has its issues and drawbacks. To be fair, it is slightly better, so I'll give it a 5 in value. That's about as high as you'll ever see a Class 5 get, more than likely. Now let's take a look at the overall final scores of the Kohler Cimarron Class 5 or 6 toilet of the 2010s. On the low end scale, the final score is a 36 out of 100, but on the higher end scale, it's a 47 out of 100. Yep, this is clearly as best as you'll get for a Class 5, and it's quite a shame considering that it's still not that great. While this toilet did surprise me in some aspects, it's still a Class 5 at the end of the day, and I'm still not the biggest fan of it. But it's about as best as you'll get for a Kohler Class 5, which really isn't saying that much.